The Carrington estate was the kind of place that made silence feel expensive. 36,000 square feet of marble floors, museum-grade lighting, and paintings worth more than most homes. With a soft hum of distant fountains whispered wealth, and the thick oak doors muffled every sound of life until it became a luxury to hear another heartbeat at all. And yet despite all of this grandeur, Edward Carrington, billionaire tech magnate, founder of Carrington Dynamics, and the most powerful man in the city's private economy, was a man whose mansion echoed with something far more hollow than quiet. The aching absence of connection, especially with the one soul he longed to reach and had never been able to, his son Lucas. At only 6 years old, Lucas had already been to more therapists, clinics, and specialists than most children saw in a lifetime, and every time Edward brought in the best money could offer, they left with the same polite, clinical shrug: nonverbal autism, sensory, processing disorder, severe social delay, diagnoses wrapped in technical terms that all whispered the same crushing truth. Lucas lived in a world his father could not enter, and no amount of intelligence, power, or wealth could build a bridge to it. And so Edward stopped trying, not because he didn't care, but because it hurt too much to fail, and in the sterile logic of his empire, failure was something he simply deleted, replaced, optimized, coded around. But fatherhood wasn't code, and Lucas wasn't a system you could debug. And then, one quiet Wednesday morning while reviewing acquisition files in the study, with a double espresso in hand, and his mind a million miles away from parenting, Edward looked up from his desk, drawn by a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter, light and full and uninhibited, coming not from a screen or a visitor or a recording, but from Lucas himself, whose usual stillness had been replaced by bright, unfiltered joy, his tiny frame shaking in delight in the corner of the room where he sat across from the newest maid, Elena, a 28-year-old woman from Georgia, who had joined the household staff just 4 months earlier, quietly folding linens, scrubbing kitchens, and keeping to herself with the graceful deference of someone who had learned early not to expect anyone to look past a uniform. But there she was now, kneeling in front of Lucas with yellow gloves still on, holding a laminated visual cue card between them, mirroring his, flapping hands with gentle mimicry, tapping the card once and then pointing at herself, then back to Lucas, as if they shared a language no one else could understand. And Edward stood frozen, his espresso halfway to his lips, watching the impossible unfold as Lucas giggled and pointed back, repeating the tap and touch with growing excitement. And in that moment, the walls of power and performance and resignation inside Edward cracked, not with spectacle, but with something slow and sacred, a realization that someone else had reached the child he loved but had failed to reach himself. Elena didn't notice him at first. Her full attention was on the boy, on his rhythm, on his cues. And it wasn't until Lucas pointed over her shoulder and squealed with excitement that she turned, startled to see her employer standing there, mouth slightly open, eyes wide not with judgment, but something softer, something raw and uncertain. "How did you do that?" Edward asked, his voice unusually hoarse, and Elena stood slowly, removing one glove and folded her hands before her with quiet respect. But her answer was as direct as it was humble. "I didn't do anything, sir. I just listened to what he wasn't saying." And that one sentence lodged itself deep inside Edward's chest, because in all the years he had poured millions into experts and equipment, no one had ever framed Lucas's silence as something worth listening to. He watched as Elena knelt again, this time inviting Edward to join them, holding out the card for him to see. Just a simple drawing of a happy face and the word friend. And Lucas tapped it again and again with a smile that cracked open a light Edward hadn't felt in years. And though the billionaire didn't move right away, something in him began to shift. Not the kind of change that comes with press releases or policy shifts, but a quiet tectonic kind. The kind that happens when a man realizes that love doesn't require brilliance, only presence. That afternoon, Edward canceled his meetings, cleared his calendar, and sat on the floor of his study beside a maid and a child, surrounded by cards and laughter and the feeling of something sacred repairing itself. And as he watched Elena make his son glow from the inside out, he knew with chilling clarity that the woman scrubbing his floors had just taught him more about humanity in 10 minutes than all his degrees and millions ever had. In the days following that shattering afternoon, Edward Carrington found himself haunted by the delicate laughter of his son and the tender cadence of Elena's quiet gestures. And as he wandered the vast, echoing corridors of his mansion, once a fortress of unyielding wealth and unspoken distance. Each opulent room, each polished surface, now seemed charged with memories of a love that had been neglected and an innocence that had somehow failed to nurture. Every morning he awoke with the ghost of Lucas's giggle echoing to the marble halls, a sound that mingled with the rhythmic ticking of the antique clocks and pulled him away from long-forgotten boardroom battles and profit margins towards something far more human. And in that pursuit he began to scour the very foundations of his life, questioning the sterile metrics of success he had clung to for decades while staring at the framed portraits of his ancestors, men who, by all accounts, had valued honor over wealth. And he wondered if perhaps there was some wisdom in their silence, some secret lodged in the spaces between spoken words that had always dismissed as weakness. That week, the mansion, which had once thrummed with the predictable cadence of servants and scheduled luncheons, transformed under his gaze into a living canvas of regret and possibility, and Edward found himself setting aside his tailored suits to instead don a simpler, softer sweater as he sat with Lucas on the sunlit terrace, where the whispers of a spring breeze mixed with the murmur of water from a nearby fountain. And for the first time in years he listened, not to the reports streaming on his phone, not to the insistent buzz of emails demanding his attention, but to his own unsteady heart in the quiet, steady breathing a child who needed him to be present. Elena, too, seemed to become both a mirror and a guide in those moments, her gentle eyes reflecting a compassion that Edward had never known existed in the polished world of corporate deals and high-stakes mergers. And as he watched her patiently sit by Lucas during therapy sessions and casual afternoons in the garden, where she taught the boy to trace the patterns of roses and listen for the secrets of the wind, he began to realize that what had once been labeled as the problem was in fact a profound, untapped language of connection that he had never bothered to learn, and that every tender smile from Lucas, every moment when the boy's eyes lit up at the sound of a familiar song or the playful rustle of leaves, was an invitation to let go of pride and embrace vulnerability. Slowly, Edward initiated conversations with his own estranged inner self, seeking counsel not in the polished reports of his advisors, but in quiet evenings spent alone in his private library, where the weight of dusty, treasured books urged him to confront a past of rigidity and control, a past marked by a relentless pursuit of profit that had overshadowed the simple truths of human warmth. And he began to rewrite his daily routines. He arranged for one-on-one sessions with a long-forgotten family counselor, took leisurely walks through the estate's sprawling gardens at dawn, and even attended support groups with other parents who, like him, had once resigned themselves to a life of measured distance and efficient love, only to be awakened by the raw, unfiltered needs of a child who communicated through laughter, gestures, and the soft language of trust. These efforts soon cascaded into more than personal epiphanies. They sparked a quiet transformation in the Carrington household, where the rigid schedules yielded to impromptu music in a lounge, where dinners were no longer sterile affairs, but gatherings punctuated by spontaneous stories, shared hopes, and occasional tears that cleansed old wounds, and where Edward, with every hesitant smile exchanged with Lucas or every appreciative nod from Elena, began to understand that wealth measured in dollars and assets paled in comparison to the richness of being present, of daring to step out of the gilded confines of his own, making it into a realm where love was not a transaction to be balanced, but a gift to be freely given. As the days turned into weeks, the transformation spread outward. Whispers in the boardroom gave way to thoughtful glances during high-stakes meetings, as colleagues and investors noticed that the once stone-faced magnate now paused to ask about his son's latest milestone. And even in the insulated world of business, Edward found that genuine connection was a currency no balance sheet could capture, a truth that resonated when he encountered unexpected resistance from advisors who feared that vulnerability might spell weakness. Yet in those moments he recalled the indelible image of Lucas's bright smile under Elena's careful guidance, and resolved that no amount of market power could compensate for the silent pain of a father's absence. And while the media had not yet caught wind of his personal evolution, Edward's change was already rippling quietly through the fabric of his existence, a subtle, yet seismic, shift that would eventually compel him to extend his newfound empathy beyond the confines of his home, reaching out to support initiatives for children with special needs, partner with organizations that promoted inclusivity in education, and even mandating that the once lofty corridors of Carrington Dynamics be reimagined as spaces where innovative ideas on human connection and diversity were nurtured alongside quarterly profit margins, All the while, every encounter with Elena's kind determination served as a silent reminder of the day she had, without a word of complaint, bridged the gap between a broken system and a fractured family. And one night, as Edward sat in the study reviewing old photographs, the faded image of Lucas clinging to him before his diagnosis, the candid shot of Elena laughing in a sun-dappled hallway, he felt a warmth rising within him, a tender, almost imperceptible stirring of his heart that challenged a long-held notion that vulnerability was a liability. And in that private moment of revelation, he vowed to forever protect and nurture the fragile bonds that had been long neglected. As autumn leaves began to fall outside the grand windows of the Carrington estate, Edward reached out to Lucas in a way he never had before, sitting with him during quiet, shared meals, asking him gentle questions about the dreams that danced behind his soft, inexpressible eyes, and learning, patiently and with newfound humility, the unspoken language that connected them, a language where every touch, every shared silence, and every burst of laughter was a step toward a kind of wholeness that no board meeting or stock option could ever provide, and was in this deeply personal revolution, marked not by grand gestures, but by small, steady acts of love and attentive care, that the billionaire discovered that the true measure of success was not in the vastness of his empire, but in the quiet capacity of his heart to listen, to learn, and ultimately to heal. The transformation that began as a subtle tremor within the Carrington household soon spread like a quiet wave across every corner of Edward's carefully constructed world, not with declarations or headlines, but through a shift in presence, through the way he lingered longer at breakfast, asking Lucas gentle yes or no questions while watching the boy light up as Elena encouraged him with reassuring nods and soft vocalizations, or through the way he began to move, through the company's glass corridors with an awareness he had never carried before, pause and ask receptionists how their children were doing, noticing when a new intern looked lost, adjusting meeting times so working parents could be home for dinner, small changes that didn't shake the economy but changed the lives orbiting it. His board of directors didn't understand at first. They watched as their iron-willed CEO became softer around the edges, introducing flexible schedules, launching an employee assistance program with a built-in neurodiversity support arm, and ordering a full audit of internal hiring practices to ensure equity from top to bottom, citing simply, if we can't make room for every kind of mind, we don't deserve to call ourselves innovators. And while some grumble behind closed doors, others, especially the quiet ones who had always kept their challenges hidden, found the courage to breathe a little easier, inspired by a man who, once unreachable, now walked, among them with purpose anchored not in performance, but in presence. And at the center of this quiet revolution stood Elena, still clad in her modest gray uniform, still rising early to fold linens and prepare tea, but now with the seat at the invisible table change, because Edward, fully aware that her intuition had unearthed something no algorithm or institution had, began bringing her into conversations about Lucas's development, consulting her insights before he signed off on treatment, plans, even accompanying her to weekend seminars about sensory communication and inclusive play, sitting silently in folding chairs beside her as experts spoke on topics that used to overwhelm him, but now stirred something fierce and paternal in his soul. And Elena, though surprised at first by his sudden interest, soon recognized the truth. This wasn't a man seeking redemption, but a father chasing reconnection, and she honored that pursuit not by flattering him, but by remaining honest gently, correcting him when he missed a cue from Lucas, reminding him that progress didn't come in straight lines or on corporate schedules, and that some victories look like stillness, like a boy tracing the texture of a velvet cushion for 10 minutes while humming to himself, and a father resisting the urge to redirect it, simply sitting and watching with love. It was during one such quiet moment, as Edward sat across from Lucas, while the boy lined up small wooden animals across the edge of a windowsill, that something shifted in the child. Not dramatically, not like a movie, but subtly, beautifully. He paused, looked at his father, and placed one of the animals in Edward's open palm. And though it was small, a wooden zebra worn smooth from use. It was everything, and Edward felt tears prick the back of his eyes, not from the gesture alone, but from a look on Elena's face when she saw it, a look of pride and quiet celebration that made him realize she had seen this coming long before he believed it was possible. In time there, partnership around Lucas deepened. Elena began tutoring other staff on how to engage with him, organizing play-based sessions that included even the gardeners and chefs, and soon the entire household began to revolve not around obligation, but shared investment in a child whose silence no longer alienated them, but invited them into deeper observation, into slowness, into empathy. And one evening, as twilight painted the estate in gold, Edward found himself pacing beside the reflecting pool, heart pounding not with anxiety, but with the growing awareness that the woman who had entered his life as a housemaid had not only helped unlock his son, but had reawakened something in him he thought had died with his divorce and the crushing diagnosis that followed. The desire to share his life, not with power players or advisors, but with someone who truly saw the world through eyes not trained to conquer it, but to cherish it. He didn't dare name the feeling yet. Not love, not attraction, just gravity. A pull toward the warmth Elena carried without trying. The way she grounded chaos with her calm. The way Lucas would seek her eyes when he became overwhelmed. The way she spoke with reverence to the smallest moments as though they were sacred. And Edward, who had spent his life sprinting past moments like those, found himself wanting to sit in them with her, quietly, honestly, and for as long as she would let him. But he was careful. He knew the power imbalance, knew the long history of men like him using affection to mask control, and so he made a vow to himself that if he ever pursued more, it would be as Edward the man, not Edward the employer, and until then he would simply honor the gift she had given him by becoming the kind of father Lucas deserved, the kind of man who could finally say not just that he had built an empire, but that he had learned, finally, how to truly belong to someone other than himself. IT began in moments too small to measure, an extra cup of tea, placed quietly beside Elena in the sunroom while Lucas played with his puzzles on the floor. A soft thank you from Edward that lingered a little longer each time it passed his lips, an accidental brush of hands when reaching for the same toy, followed by a pause, a glance, a silence heavy with something neither of them dared name. But it was there, quietly pulsing beneath the rhythm of their daily rituals, like an ember smoldering under layers of caution and grace. And though neither of them reached for it, both felt it warming the air between them as Lucas's world continued to blossom in ways that stunned his therapists, his teachers, and even himself. He had begun using picture boards to make choices, humming recognizable melodies when he was happy, and seeking out Edward with a quiet confidence that had once seemed impossible. And yet, it was Elena's presence that remained the cornerstone of his progress, the anchor in every storm, and Edward knew, with humbling clarity, that she had given his son something no medical team ever could, the gift of emotional safety, of being seen without being corrected, of being loved without condition. And in witnessing that gift every day, something in Edward softened to the point of trembling, as if the very foundation of the man he once was could no longer hold under the weight of this unexpected reverence for the woman who had taught him how to father, how to feel, and perhaps, if he let himself fall far enough, how to love again. But he didn't speak of it, not yet, because the risk of saying the wrong thing and losing what had quietly become the most sacred bond in his life was too great. So instead, he simply stayed close, walking alongside Elena during their evening strolls to the garden after Lucas had gone to sleep, listening to her stories about her mother's humming and her grandmother's faith, watching how her voice turned lyrical when she spoke of home, of Georgia summers, of porch swings and hands worn from labor but strong enough to lift generations, and Edward, who had spent a lifetime surrounded by artificial beauty, felt humbled by the depth of her authenticity, the way she carried both elegance and struggle without apology. It was during one of those walks, as fireflies blinked in the lavender dusk, that Elena finally turned to him and said softly, "You don't need to keep thanking me, Mr. Carrington." And he stopped mid-step, heart thudding as he searched her face for what she meant only for her to add gently, "Lucas isn't who he is because of me. He's just finally been allowed to be." And those words struck him with such force that he didn't respond right away, just swallowed hard and whispered, "Then maybe you're the first person who ever truly allowed me to be too." And in that silence, they both stood still, neither advancing nor retreating, as if the air itself was holding its breath around them. Later that night, as Edward poured himself a glass of wine in the dim kitchen, he found himself staring at the tea mug Elena always used, the one with the small chip near the rim and the faded yellow daffodil print. And something in him broke open with quiet certainty. He didn't want to go back to a life without this, without her, without the quiet peace she had brought not just to Lucas, but to every hollow room he used to pass through like a stranger in his own house. And yet, he knew the danger of confusing gratitude with intimacy, of mistaking proximity for permission. So he did the only thing he could think of that honored both her dignity and his heart. He stepped away from control and into vulnerability. The next morning, he met with his legal team and quietly rewrote the structure of her employment, giving Elena full independence as Lucas's educational aide under a private foundation set up in the boy's name, severing the chain of household hierarchy that made her answer to him, allowing her to decide freely what future she wanted, whether near or far. And when he presented it to her, nervous hands fidgeting in his lap, he simply said, "I've made it so that no matter what you choose, it will never be because you had no other option." And when she read the papers, brows furrowed, tears slowly filling her eyes, she whispered, "You didn't have to do this." And he replied, voice trembling, "But I did because I can't bear thought that I only mattered to you because you worked here." And in that moment, everything between them shifted, not with a kiss, not with a grand confession, but with the kind of mutual knowing that only two people who had rebuilt a family together could understand. From that day forward, things did not become easier, but they became clearer. Elena stayed, not because she had to, but because she wanted to, and Edward stopped walking like a man who had everything to prove and started living like a man who had something to protect, and Lucas, whose world had once been locked behind silence and routine, began to draw small hearts in his sketchbook, sometimes placing them between stick figures that looked a lot like the three of them, standing in a garden, smiling beneath a sun drawn too large, as if he understood something they hadn't yet dared to speak aloud, that sometimes family finds you in the least expected places, and that love, when rooted in patience and humility, can bloom quietly into something stronger than anything money could ever build. The Carrington estate bloomed with quiet life that spring, not in lavish displays of wealth or extravagant parties, as it once had in Edward's colder days, but in smaller, more meaningful ways. Vases of freshly picked wildflowers placed by Elena in rooms once untouched, wind chimes that Lucas helped string along the veranda, singing softly in the breeze, and the gentle rhythm of new rituals that now defined their days, not by schedule but by intention. Morning walks in the orchard where Lucas held his father's hand without prompting, evening music sessions where he and Elena played the piano in soft duet, and family dinners where conversation didn't rely on many words but was rich with glances, gestures, and the contentment of simply being together. The staff, once distant and trained to blend into the walls, had relaxed into something closer to community, taking cues from the new warmth that pulsed through every corridor, and even Edward's longtime butler, Mr. Hastings, a man of rigid formality, had begun smiling more often, pausing longer to ask how Lucas was progressing, calling Elena Miss Elena with a fondness that surprised even him. But amid all this subtle beauty, a question hovered between Edward and Elena, unspoken but felt in every moment they shared outside the lines of duty. What were they now, and what could they become? And though the answer pulsed beneath every glance, every conversation that lingered too long at the garden gate, neither dared say it out loud, until one afternoon, when the world offered them a moment too honest to ignore. Lucas had been invited to a private showcase for neurodivergent children hosted by a local arts foundation. Edward now supported, and for the first time, the boy had chosen to read a poem aloud. Not a long one, not perfect in rhythm or volume, but his own words, shaped through cards and images and transcribed by Elena onto thick white paper. And when he stood there in his little navy blazer, his hands trembling as he softly read, "I like the sky / I like the sun / I like when daddy sits with me / I like when she hums." There wasn't a dry eye in the room, least of all Edward's, who felt his chest crack, open as he reached for Elena's hand without thinking, and she took it. Not because she was expected to, but because she wanted to. And as Lucas stepped off the platform and threw himself into both their arms, they held him together, their hands still clasped between his shoulders, hearts beating in rhythm. And suddenly there was no room left for hesitation, no barrier between them, but the one Edward was finally ready to cross. That evening, as twilight turned the garden to gold, Edward walked, with Elena beside the reflecting pool where so much of their story had unfolded in quiet glances, and he stopped beneath the old cypress tree where Lucas had once drawn chalk hearts, turning to her with the gentle solemnity of a man who had been humbled by grace and sharpened by love. And he said, "You changed my son's life, but you saved mine, And Elena, her eyes glistening with something deeper than surprise, whispered, "And you gave me a place to belong without asking me to disappear." And there was truth, tender and full, not wrapped in declarations but standing raw between them. And when Edward stepped closer and cupped her cheek, she didn't flinch or pull away. She leaned in and they kissed, not like a fairy tale, not like a grand finale, but like a promise. A quiet joining of two lives once defined by loss and duty, now shaped by presence and love. From that night on, nothing changed, and yet everything did. Elena remained Lucas's guide, but now also Edward's partner in every way that mattered, walking beside him through charity galas and therapy appointments, media inquiries and boardroom recalibrations, all while fiercely guarding their family's privacy, ensuring that their story would never be reduced to a headline or a hashtag, because what they had built was too sacred for spectacle. They didn't rush marriage, didn't parade their love, but they lived it visibly, authentically, and when Lucas drew their family again, this time 3 figures under a sun that now seemed perfectly proportioned, each of them holding hands, smiling without restraint. It hung proudly in the main hallway of the estate, framed in gold leaf not because it was art, but because it was truth. And in the years to come, as Edward Carrington became known not just for his empire, but for his advocacy in neurodiversity and educational inclusion, and as Elena quietly co-founded a nationwide program training caregivers and parents in sensory-attuned care, their love remained rooted not in the power they wielded or the eyes that watched them, but in the boy who first taught them how to listen in silence, how to show up without expectation, and how to build a family not with blueprints or blood, but with patience, dignity, and the courage to let the heart stir in its own time.